The strangest thing about that night wasn't the blackout. It was the knock that came after the city went dark. The storm arrived over Brooklyn just after sunset, rolling across the skyline in layers of charcoal clouds that swallowed the last traces of orange light. By 7:30, the streets below Charlotte Hayes' apartment were already shining with rain. Headlights stretched across wet pavement like ribbons of gold, and the wind rattled the old windows in her third-floor walk-up hard enough to make the glass tremble. Charlotte sat cross-legged on her couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a paperback novel resting open in her lap. The small apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon tea and old books from the community library where she worked. It wasn't glamorous. The furniture had come from thrift stores. The radiator made strange noises every winter. The kitchen sink occasionally leaked, but it was hers, and after years of scraping together enough money to survive in New York, that mattered. Then every light in the apartment died at once. The refrigerator hummed into silence. The television screen across the room went black. Outside, an entire section of the city seemed to disappear in a single breath. Charlotte looked up. For a moment, the only sound was rain tapping against the glass. Then came distant voices from the street below, car horns, confused shouting. The city had gone dark. Great, she muttered, setting her book aside. She reached into a kitchen drawer and found the emergency candles she kept for storms. Within minutes, warm flickering light danced across the apartment walls. Shadows stretched long and soft through the tiny living room. The blackout transformed everything. Familiar corners suddenly felt mysterious. The city beyond her windows looked unfamiliar without its endless glow. She stood beside the glass and stared outside. Entire blocks sat in darkness. Only occasional flashes of lightning illuminated rooftops and water towers. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed briefly before fading away. Most people hated blackouts. Charlotte wasn't sure why, but part of her found them strangely beautiful. The world slowed down. Phones lost importance. Screens disappeared. People were forced to look up, to notice each other again. She carried her tea to the window and watched rain slide down the glass. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The storm intensified. Wind howled between buildings. Tree branches swayed wildly along the street. That was when she noticed someone standing outside. A figure appeared beneath the awning across the street, tall, motionless, partially hidden by darkness and rain. Charlotte frowned. Most people had already rushed indoors, yet this man remained there alone, waiting, watching. She couldn't tell his age, couldn't see his face clearly. Just the outline of broad shoulders beneath a dark jacket. Lightning flashed overhead. For a fraction of a second she saw him more clearly. He looked exhausted. Then darkness returned. Charlotte stepped away from the window. It wasn't her business. New York was for strangers. People came and went every day. She tried returning to her book. 5 minutes later, another crack of thunder shook the building. Then came a sound she wasn't expecting. 3 sharp knocks. Her eyes lifted immediately toward the apartment door. The knocks came again, slow, deliberate. Charlotte froze. Very few people visited unannounced, especially during storms, especially during blackouts. She set her mug down carefully and walked toward the door. Her heartbeat quickened. "Who is it?" she called. For a moment there was only rain. Then a deep voice answered through the hallway. "I'm sorry to bother you." The voice sounded strained, controlled, tired. The building manager downstairs said someone on this floor might be willing to help. Charlotte frowned. She moved closer. "Help with what?" Silence lingered for a second. "I need a place to sit for a few minutes until the storm passes." Something about the answer felt odd, not threatening, just incomplete. Charlotte looked through the peephole. A man stood beneath the emergency hallway light, dark hair damp from rain, clean-shaven, maybe mid-30s. His posture remained steady, but there was something unusual about the way he held one arm close to his side. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. Every sensible warning she had ever heard told her not to open the door. New York taught caution quickly, yet something else caught her attention. His eyes. Even through the peephole, they looked strangely distant, not dangerous, just tired, the kind of tired that lived deeper than exhaustion. Thunder rolled again overhead. The hallway lights flickered weakly. Charlotte hesitated. Then she unlocked the door. The man looked slightly surprised when it opened. Rainwater still clung to his jacket. Up close, he appeared older than she first thought. Not old, just carrying more weight than most people his age. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You really didn't have to." Charlotte stepped aside. Most people would leave someone standing in a storm. For the first time, something almost resembling a smile touched his face. Small, brief, gone a second later. He entered the apartment and glanced around. At the bookshelves, the candles, the old furniture, the photographs hanging beside the kitchen, he noticed everything, every detail, every corner. Charlotte suddenly became aware of how small the apartment felt. "You can sit down," she said. "I'll make fresh tea." The stranger nodded once. "That's very kind of you." Neither of them noticed the faint stain of red water dripping silently from the edge of his jacket onto the hardwood floor, and before the night was over, that small detail would change both of their lives forever. The first thing Charlotte noticed was the silence. The storm still rattled the windows, and rain still swept across Brooklyn in silver sheets, but inside the apartment everything felt strangely calm. The stranger sat at the small kitchen table, one hand wrapped around the mug of tea she had placed in front of him. Candlelight flickered across his face, revealing sharp features and shadows beneath tired eyes. He looked like a man who had not rested in a very long time. Charlotte moved toward the kitchen drawer and retrieved a clean dish towel. As she turned back toward the table, her gaze dropped to the floor. A dark stain glistened beside one of the chair legs. For a moment she thought rainwater had dripped from his jacket. Then another drop landed beside it. Her stomach tightened. "You are hurt," she said quietly. The stranger followed her eyes and glanced down. For the first time, something resembling annoyance crossed his face. Not annoyance at her, annoyance at himself. "It is nothing," he replied. Charlotte folded her arms. That answer usually means the opposite. A faint breath escaped him that might have been a laugh. "You are surprisingly persistent. I work at a library," she said. "You would be surprised how stubborn librarians can be." The stranger looked away toward the rain-covered window. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he slowly removed his jacket. Charlotte noticed that he moved carefully, protecting one side of his body. The sleeve of his dark shirt was damp. Whatever had happened before he arrived, he clearly did not want to discuss it. Charlotte disappeared into the bathroom and returned with a basic first aid kit. "I am not a doctor," she said, setting it on the table. "But if you are staying long enough to drink my tea, you are staying long enough for me to make sure you are okay." He stared at the kit, then at her. Something unreadable passed through his expression. Most people would have called the police. Most people are not sitting in this apartment. For the first time his eyes softened, only slightly, but Charlotte noticed. He accepted the first aid kit without another argument. An hour later the storm intensified. Wind howled through the city like a living thing. The blackout showed no sign of ending. Charlotte spread an extra blanket across the couch while the stranger remained near the window, watching the dark street below. He seemed alert even while exhausted, as though he expected something or someone. "You can sleep here," Charlotte said. "I will take the bedroom." "No." The answer came immediately. "Then we can argue until sunrise." Another faint smile appeared and disappeared. "You always try to help people?" Charlotte shrugged. "Not always." "Then why me?" The question lingered between them. Charlotte looked toward the candles dancing along the bookshelves. "Because the city went dark tonight," she finally said, "and nobody should be alone during something like that." The stranger lowered his eyes. The answer seemed to affect him more than she expected. Outside, another flash of lightning illuminated the room. For an instant his face appeared almost haunted. Then darkness returned. Time passed. They talked in fragments. Small conversations. Safe conversations. Charlotte learned nothing important. He never explained where he came from. Never answered direct questions for very long. Yet somehow she learned other things. He preferred listening to speaking. He noticed details others missed. He carried himself with unusual confidence, and despite his reserved demeanor, he treated every word she spoke as if it mattered. Sometime after midnight, Charlotte drifted asleep in her bedroom while the storm continued outside. The blackout remained. The candles burned low. The apartment settled into silence. That less than a mile away, several black SUVs slowly moved through rain-soaked streets searching for someone. Phone calls were being made. Orders were being given. Powerful people were growing increasingly desperate, but none of that reached her apartment. Dawn arrived quietly. Pale grey light filtered through the curtains. The storm had finally moved east. Charlotte opened her eyes and immediately remembered the stranger. She stepped into the living room. The couch was empty. The blanket remained folded neatly. The tea mug sat washed and drying beside the sink. For a moment she wondered if she had imagined the entire night. Then she noticed something resting on the kitchen table. A watch, heavy, elegant, expensive enough to look completely out of place in her tiny apartment. Charlotte picked it up carefully. The metal felt cold against her fingers. There was no note, no explanation. Nothing except the watch itself and the faint memory of a stranger who had arrived during the darkest night of the year and vanished before sunrise. She carried it toward the window and stared down at the awakening city below. And as the first lights slowly returned across Brooklyn, Charlotte realized she did not even know the name of the man she could not stop thinking about. For the next 2 weeks, Charlotte told herself she was being ridiculous. People met strangers in New York every day. They shared elevators, subway seats, coffee shop lines, and never saw each other again. That was how the city worked. Yet every morning when she left for the library, her eyes drifted toward the watch resting on her kitchen counter. It seemed impossible that someone would leave behind something so expensive by accident. She had considered taking it to a police station. She had considered leaving it with the building manager. She had even searched online for a manufacturer name engraved inside the clasp. Nothing gave her an answer. The watch remained exactly where she had found it, and somehow the memory of the man who had left it behind remained there too. Life slowly returned to normal after the blackout. The city lights came back. The trains ran on schedule. Traffic filled the streets. Brooklyn settled into its familiar rhythm. Charlotte spent her days helping children find books, organizing reading programs, and recommending novels to elderly regulars who visited the library every Tuesday. On the surface, nothing had changed. Then small things began happening. The first was her landlord. For 3 months he had ignored requests to repair the leaking pipe beneath her kitchen sink. Every conversation ended the same way: promises, excuses, delays. Then one Thursday afternoon she returned home and found 2 plumbers finishing the repair. The pipe had been completely replaced. When Charlotte asked what had happened, the landlord simply smiled. "Someone convinced me it was overdue." Before she could ask who, he walked away. She dismissed it as coincidence. A week later, another strange thing happened. The community library received an anonymous donation large enough to replace several outdated computers. The donation arrived without a name attached. No publicity, no recognition, no explanation. The library director nearly cried when she saw the paperwork. "Do you know how many kids this helps?" she kept repeating. Charlotte did not know why, but she found herself thinking about a pair of tired eyes illuminated by candlelight. Again she pushed the thought away. Coincidence, nothing more. Then came the third incident. On a rainy Friday evening, Charlotte left work carrying 2 bags filled with returned books. She had barely reached the corner when a delivery truck splashed through a puddle, sending water across the sidewalk. A black umbrella suddenly appeared above, could reach her. Charlotte turned, startled. A man in a dark suit stood beside her. Not the stranger, someone else. Older, professional. "Careful," he said politely. "The roads are terrible tonight." Charlotte nodded. "Thank you." The man smiled, stepped away and disappeared into the crowd before she could say anything else. The encounter lasted less than 10 seconds, yet something about it unsettled her. It felt intentional, as if someone had been watching. That feeling followed her home. It remained there Monday morning when she stopped at a small cafe near the library. The owner greeted her with unusual enthusiasm. "Your coffee is already paid for." Charlotte blinked. "Paid for by who?" The owner pointed toward the window. Charlotte turned hers immediately. The chair beside the window was empty. Whoever had paid was already gone. "Did he leave a name?" she asked. The owner shook his head. "No, just said you deserved a good morning." Charlotte carried the coffee outside and stood beneath the autumn sunlight. Her pulse quickened. This no longer felt random. Too many things had happened, too many moments connected by an invisible thread she could not see. That evening she returned home and opened a notebook. She wrote down everything: the repaired sink, the donation, the umbrella, the coffee. 1 page became 2, 2 became 3. The more she looked at the list, the more impossible it seemed. Someone was helping her. Quietly, deliberately, consistently. The question was why. The answer arrived 3 days later. Charlotte was shelving books near the library entrance when a television mounted above the front desk switched to a local news segment. Most patrons ignored it. Charlotte almost did too. Then a photograph appeared on the screen. She froze. The image showed a man stepping from a black SUV surrounded by reporters and security personnel. His dark hair was neatly styled. His expression remained calm beneath a storm of flashing cameras. Charlotte felt her breath catch. She knew that face. She had seen it illuminated by candlelight. The television reporter spoke his name clearly, but the noise of the library seemed to disappear around her. Charlotte could only stare at the screen as recognition slowly settled over her, and for the first time since the blackout, She realized the stranger she had invited into her apartment might be far more important than she had ever imagined. Charlotte stood frozen beside the circulation desk long after the news segment ended. Around her, library patrons continued their conversations. Pages turned, computer keyboards clicked, a child laughed somewhere near the reading corner, yet the world felt strangely distant. The face on the television remained locked in her mind. She had spent 2 weeks imagining dozens of possibilities. A businessman, a lawyer, a doctor, maybe someone wealthy enough to forget an expensive watch. She had never imagined this. The evening news identified him as Luca Moretti, a powerful entrepreneur whose companies owned commercial real estate, shipping interests, restaurants, and charitable foundations throughout New York. The reporter described him as influential, respected, private. The screen showed footage of him stepping through a crowd of reporters while security personnel created space around him. He looked exactly as Charlotte remembered. Calm, controlled, unreadable, yet she remembered something the cameras could not show, the exhaustion in his eyes, the silence between his words. The way he had stared out her apartment window as though carrying a burden no one else could see. Charlotte, the voice startled her. She turned to find her co-worker Allison holding a stack of returned books. "You look like you saw a ghost." Charlotte forced a smile. "Just tired." Allison glanced toward the television. "Everyone is talking about that guy lately." Charlotte tried to sound casual. "Why? Apparently he donated millions to hospitals and schools this year." Allison shrugged. "People either love him or fear him. Depends who you ask." Charlotte looked back at the dark screen. Love him or fear him. Somehow neither description matched the man she remembered sitting quietly at her kitchen table holding a mug of tea. That evening, she took the watch out of her apartment for the first time. Wrapped carefully inside a scarf, it rested in her purse as she rode the subway into Manhattan. She had no appointment, no plan, only curiosity. The address listed online led her to a glass tower overlooking the East River. The building rose high above surrounding streets, reflecting sunlight across polished steel and blue windows. People in tailored suits moved through revolving doors. Luxury cars lined the curb. Charlotte immediately felt out of place. She almost turned around. Then she remembered the watch. Taking a deep breath, she entered the lobby. The marble floors gleamed beneath soft lighting. A receptionist greeted her with professional warmth. "Can I help you?" Charlotte placed the watch carefully on the counter. "I think this belongs to Mr. Moretti." The receptionist's expression changed slightly. Not surprise, recognition. "One moment, please." She disappeared into a nearby office. Charlotte waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. Finally another woman approached, older, elegant, sharp-eyed. "You have something for Mr. Moretti?" Charlotte nodded and explained how the watch had been left behind after the blackout. The woman listened without interruption. When Charlotte finished, the woman looked down at the watch and then back at her. "Mr. Moretti has been searching for this." Charlotte blinked. "He has." Something about the answer felt carefully chosen. Before Charlotte could ask another question, the woman smiled. "Thank you for returning it." Charlotte hesitated. "Could I speak with him?" The woman glanced toward the elevators. "Unfortunately, Mr. Moretti is unavailable today." Disappointment arrived faster than Charlotte expected. She immediately felt foolish for feeling it. "Of course," she said. "I understand." The woman accepted the watch. "I will personally make sure he receives it." Charlotte thanked her and left. The entire encounter lasted less than 10 minutes, yet as she stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, she could not shake the feeling that something unusual had happened. Less than a mile away, inside a private office overlooking the river, a phone vibrated across a polished desk. A man looked down at the message appearing on the screen. The photograph attached showed a familiar face leaving the building. For several seconds, Luca Moretti stared at the image. Then his gaze shifted toward the watch now resting beside him. The same watch Charlotte had returned, the same watch he had intentionally left behind. A faint smile appeared, the first genuine smile anyone in the room had seen from him all day. Back on the street, Charlotte remained completely unaware. She continued walking toward the subway station, convinced she had closed a chapter that began during the blackout. Unfortunately for her, the chapter had only just begun, and somewhere high above the city, a man who never forgot kindness had finally found her again. The following week should have felt ordinary. Charlotte wanted it to feel ordinary. She buried herself in work, organized reading events, repaired damaged books, and helped children search for stories about distant worlds. Yet no matter how busy she became, strange coincidences continued appearing around her life. The first arrived on a Tuesday morning when the library director called an emergency staff meeting. Everyone expected budget cuts. Instead, the director stood smiling beside a projection screen displaying architectural drawings. A major anonymous donor had agreed to fund a complete renovation of the children's reading wing. New furniture, new computers. The room erupted into applause. Charlotte smiled with everyone else, but a familiar feeling settled quietly in her chest. Anonymous, again. After the meeting ended, she lingered near the director's office. "Do we know who donated?" she asked casually. The director laughed. "If I knew, I would probably be signing thank you letters all afternoon." Charlotte nodded, but the answer only deepened her suspicion. Later that evening, she walked home through Brooklyn beneath a sky painted with streaks of orange and purple. Autumn had fully arrived. Leaves gathered along curbs. Storefront lights reflected across damp sidewalks. Everything felt peaceful. Then she noticed the black SUV. It sat across the street beside a coffee shop. The vehicle looked expensive, immaculate, familiar. Charlotte slowed her pace. The SUV remained parked as people moved around it. Nothing happened. No one approached her. No doors opened. Eventually she convinced herself she was imagining connections that did not exist and continued home. Unfortunately, the image remained in her mind long after sunset. 3 days later, Charlotte attended a neighborhood fundraiser supporting after-school literacy programs. The event occupied the ballroom of a restored historic building overlooking the East River. String lights hung from exposed beams. Soft jazz drifted through the air. Teachers, local business owners, and community leaders filled the room. Charlotte nearly declined the invitation. Crowds exhausted her, but the library director insisted. "Networking is good for you," she had said. Charlotte was beginning to regret listening. She stood near a refreshment table, sipping sparkling water and counting the minutes until she could leave, when a subtle shift moved through the crowd. Conversations softened, heads turned, people straightened their posture. Charlotte followed their gaze toward the entrance. Her breath caught instantly. Luca Moretti had just entered the ballroom. He wore a dark suit without a tie, his jacket perfectly tailored, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. Several people approached him immediately, others simply watched from a distance. Charlotte felt rooted to the floor. The television had not prepared her for seeing him in person again. The stranger from her apartment seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the man standing across the room. One belonged to a candlelit blackout, the other belonged to a world of influence and power. For several moments she considered leaving. Then Luca looked up. Across the crowded ballroom, his eyes found hers immediately, not eventually. Immediately, the reaction was impossible to miss. Recognition appeared before either of them moved. Charlotte's pulse quickened. Around them, conversations continued. Music played. Glasses clinked softly. Yet the distance between them suddenly felt much smaller. Luca excused himself from the group surrounding him and began walking toward her. Charlotte's heart pounded harder with every step. When he finally stopped a few feet away, neither spoke for a second. Then his gaze softened in a way she had only seen once before. During a blackout, Charlotte Hayes, he said quietly. Her eyes widened. "You know my name. I owed you a proper thank you." She folded her arms. "Most people send a card." A smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, real this time, unforced. "Most people are not responsible for saving my evening during a city-wide blackout." Charlotte searched his face. "You left before sunrise. I had responsibilities waiting for me." "You also left your watch." His expression grew thoughtful. "I suppose I did." Something about the answer felt deliberate. Before Charlotte could press further, several guests approached requesting Luca's attention. The moment fractured. The distance returned. Yet before turning away, Luca looked back at her one final time. "I never properly thanked you," he said. "Perhaps we should fix that." Then he disappeared into the crowd. Charlotte remained standing beneath the warm ballroom lights, trying to understand why a man like Luca Moretti seemed determined to remember a single act of kindness that should have been forgotten long ago. For the next several days, Charlotte found herself paying attention to details she would have ignored before. A black SUV parked across the street for a few minutes longer than necessary, a man in a tailored suit holding a door open before she reached it. The owner of her favorite bookstore refusing to let her pay for a novel because someone had already covered the cost. None of these things were dramatic, none of them were enough to prove anything. Yet together they formed a pattern she could no longer dismiss. It felt as though an invisible hand kept smoothing obstacles out of her path. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it made her uneasy. One chilly Saturday afternoon, Charlotte accepted an invitation from Allison to visit an outdoor arts festival in Manhattan. The event occupied several blocks along the waterfront. Food vendors lined the sidewalks. Local musicians performed beneath white tents. Families wandered between exhibits while ferries crossed the river behind them. It felt a world away from the quiet order of the library. Charlotte welcomed the distraction. For a few hours she almost succeeded in forgetting about Luca Moretti. Then she saw him again, not in person. On a giant digital billboard mounted above a nearby building, the advertisements displayed a charitable initiative supporting schools throughout New York. Luca stood beside a group of children holding books. His expression remained composed, professional, confident. People walked past the image without a second glance. Charlotte stopped moving entirely. It was strange how two versions of the same man now existed in her mind. One belonged to television screens, newspaper articles, and billion-dollar projects. The other belonged to candlelight, rain, and a tiny apartment during a blackout. Allison noticed her staring. "You really are fascinated by this guy." Charlotte quickly looked away. "I am not fascinated," Allison laughed. "Sure." Charlotte changed the subject. But the conversation lingered in her thoughts long after. Later that afternoon, while exploring an exhibit featuring historical photographs of New York City, Charlotte paused in front of a display showcasing images from recent city events. Hundreds of photographs covered an enormous wall: parades, festivals, charity galas, community projects. Her eyes drifted across the collection casually until something made her stop. Near the corner of one enlarged photograph stood a familiar figure. The image showed a ribbon-cutting ceremony outside a children's hospital. Politicians and donors filled the foreground. Yet Charlotte barely noticed them. Her attention locked onto the man standing several feet behind the crowd, Luca Moretti. He was not looking at the cameras. He was looking somewhere else entirely. At first, Charlotte could not understand why the image felt strange. Then she followed the direction of his gaze. Her breath caught. The person he was looking at was her. The photograph had been taken weeks earlier during a library outreach event she attended with several children. Charlotte barely remembered the day, yet there she was near the edge of the frame, helping a little girl carry a stack of books. Luca stood in the background watching, not the event, not the cameras. "Her Charlotte?" Allison asked. "Are you okay?" Charlotte swallowed. "I think I need some air." They stepped outside onto the waterfront promenade. Wind rolled off the river carrying the scent of salt and autumn leaves. Ferries moved across sparkling water. The city's skyline stretched toward the clouds, yet Charlotte barely noticed any of it. The photograph replayed inside her mind. Why had he been watching her? How long had he known who she was? More importantly, why did the realizations send equal parts nervousness and curiosity through her chest? Less than a mile away, inside a glass office high above Manhattan, Luca stood beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the same river. A trusted advisor entered carrying a tablet. The surveillance team reports she saw the hospital photograph. Luca remained silent. "Should we remove the image?" the advisor asked. Luca looked toward the skyline. The late afternoon sun reflected gold across the water below. "No," he said quietly. "Leave it," the advisor hesitated. "She will start asking questions." A faint smile touched Luca's face. "She already has." Back at the waterfront, Charlotte rested her hands against the railing and stared at the city before her. For weeks she had assumed she was slowly uncovering pieces of a mystery. Standing there now, she realized something far more unsettling. The mystery might have started long before she ever noticed it. And somewhere within the city of glass towers and hidden influence, Luca Moretti seemed to know far more about her than she knew about him. Charlotte spent the next 3 days trying to convince herself that she was overreacting. The photograph could have meant nothing. People looked at other people all the time. A camera could capture a misleading moment, a fraction of a second. A coincidence frozen forever, yet the explanation felt weaker each time she repeated it. By Thursday evening, curiosity finally won. Rain drifted lightly across Brooklyn as she locked the library doors and stepped onto the sidewalk. The sky hung low and grey above the city. Traffic moved slowly through wet streets. Charlotte adjusted her coat and started walking toward the subway station. She never made it there. A familiar black SUV waited beside the curb. The vehicle looked exactly like the one she had noticed several times before. Immaculate, quiet, intentional. One of the rear doors opened. Charlotte stopped walking. Her pulse immediately accelerated. For a moment, nobody emerged. Then Luca Moretti stepped onto the sidewalk. The city seemed to soften around him, not because people recognized him. Most did not. It was something else. The calm certainty with which he moved, the way he occupied space without demanding attention. Rain gathered on the shoulders of his dark coat as he approached. Charlotte crossed her arms. "You really need to stop appearing unexpectedly." A faint smile touched his face. "I could say the same thing about you. I am serious. So am I." The smile faded. "May we talk?" Charlotte should have walked away. Every reasonable instinct suggested she should. Instead, she found herself following him into a small cafe overlooking the river. The evening crowd was light. Soft music drifted from hidden speakers. Warm lamps reflected against rain-streaked windows. They sat at a corner table facing the water. For several moments neither spoke. Charlotte studied him carefully. The same eyes, the same voice, the same quiet presence she remembered from the blackout. Yet now she saw something she had missed before. Power. Not arrogance, not entitlement. Power hidden beneath restraint. "You know," she finally said, "most people would consider this extremely strange. I know. You seem to know an awful lot about me." Luca nodded once. "I do." Charlotte stared at him. The honesty caught her off guard. "Why?" The question lingered between them. Luca looked toward the river beyond the glass. Ferries moved across dark water beneath scattered lights. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the practiced confidence she had seen in interviews. "Because I never forgot what happened that night." Charlotte lowered her eyes briefly. "I gave you tea and a couch. You gave me kindness." The answer came immediately. "There is a difference." She did not know how to respond. Luca leaned back slightly. "Most people see what I own, what I control, what I can do for them." His gaze returned to hers. "You were the first person in a very long time who simply saw another human being standing in the rain." Charlotte felt her breath catch. Outside, headlights slid across wet streets. Inside, the noise of the cafe seemed distant. "Who are you really?" she asked quietly. Luca remained silent for several seconds. When he finally answered, his expression changed, more honest, as though a mask had finally become too heavy to wear. "The truth is not simple. Try me." He studied her face carefully, perhaps measuring whether she truly wanted the answer. Then he nodded. "The night of the blackout, I was not supposed to be walking through Brooklyn alone." Charlotte's heartbeat quickened. "Why?" "Because there were people searching for me." The words landed heavily, not dramatic, just factual. "Searching for you?" Luca looked down at his hands. "I built an empire over many years. Businesses, investments, shipping companies, real estate." He paused. "But there are parts of my world that do not appear in newspapers." Charlotte felt the room grow quieter. Every instinct told her she was standing at the edge of something enormous, something that would change everything she thought she knew. Luca met her eyes. "Charlotte," his voice softened. "The man who knocked on your door during the blackout was not a businessman looking for shelter." A long silence followed. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Somewhere behind them, a coffee cup settled onto a saucer. Then Luca spoke the words that finally connected every mystery, every coincidence, every unanswered question. "I was the stranger who came to your apartment that night." Charlotte stared at him, unable to look away. The confirmation should have been obvious. Yet hearing it aloud changed everything, and before she could process what that meant, Luca leaned forward slightly and revealed the one truth she never expected to hear. "And whether you realize it or not," he said quietly, "you saved my life." Charlotte forgot about the coffee growing cold between her hands. She forgot about the rain beyond the windows and the conversations drifting through the cafe. For several seconds she simply stared at Luca. The words echoed inside her mind. "You saved my life." The statement felt too large, too impossible. "I do not understand," she said quietly. Luca nodded as if he had expected that answer. "I know." He looked toward the river, gathering his thoughts carefully. The blackout created chaos throughout the city. Communication systems failed. Transportation stopped. People disappeared into the darkness. His gaze returned to hers, including me. Charlotte remained silent. Something told her not to interrupt. "That night I needed somewhere no one would think to look." His voice stayed calm, but a weight lingered beneath every word. "I needed time, a few hours, nothing more." Charlotte remembered the exhausted man standing outside her apartment building, the rain dripping from his coat, the tiredness in his eyes. Suddenly the memory felt different, larger. "And you chose my door?" she asked. A faint smile touched his face. "No," Charlotte blinked. "No, your building manager mentioned that someone on the third floor was kind enough to help anyone during emergencies." For the first time since the conversation began, genuine amusement appeared in his eyes. "Apparently you have a reputation." Charlotte looked away, embarrassed. "That sounds like something Mr. Donnelly would say." "It is exactly something Mr. Donnelly would say." The moment eased some of the tension between them, only some. Too many questions still remained. "You said I saved your life. Her voice softened. How? Luca studied the steam rising from his untouched coffee. Because if you had not opened that door, I would have continued moving through the city. He paused. And that would have been a mistake. Charlotte felt a chill despite the warmth of the cafe. You mean someone was following you? Luca did not answer directly. What matters is that I ended up somewhere unexpected. His gaze settled on hers. Somewhere safe. The sincerity in his voice made it difficult to look away. Charlotte had spent weeks imagining hidden motives behind every coincidence. Yet sitting across from him now, she sensed something much simpler. The kind people rarely expressed anymore. So everything that happened afterward, she began. The library donation, the repairs, the coffee. Luca sighed quietly. Some of those things may have been my fault. Charlotte almost laughed despite herself. May have been? I am not very good at doing nothing. That is one way to describe it. A smile appeared between them before fading into something softer, more comfortable. Outside, the rain gradually slowed. Headlights reflected across wet pavement. The city glowed beneath thousands of lights stretching toward the horizon. For a while, neither spoke. The silence felt surprisingly easy. Charlotte realized she had expected someone powerful to dominate conversations, to fill every moment with confidence. Instead, Luca seemed most comfortable listening, observing, paying attention. Eventually, he broke the silence. Can I ask you something? Charlotte nodded. Why did you help me? She frowned slightly. We already talked about this. Not really. His expression remained thoughtful. Most people would have been cautious. I was cautious. Most people would have sent me away. Charlotte considered the question carefully. The answer felt embarrassingly simple. You looked alone. Luca's eyes lowered briefly. That is all. Is that not enough? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Charlotte noticed the subtle shift immediately. Whatever world Luca belonged to, it was not a world where people helped without expecting something in return. You really are different, he said quietly. Charlotte shook her head. No, I just think people deserve kindness when they need it. Luca looked out toward the river again. The fading daylight reflected across the water in streaks of silver and gold. When he spoke, his voice carried an honesty she had not heard before. You have no idea how rare that is. The words lingered between them. Charlotte felt something changing. Not trust, not yet, but understanding. For the first time, the man sitting across from her no longer felt like a mystery appearing in fragments. He felt human, complicated, guarded, lonely. Unfortunately for Charlotte, there was one truth Luca still had not revealed, and less than 24 hours later, a discovery waiting inside an old photograph would force both of them to confront secrets neither could avoid any longer. Charlotte could not stop thinking about the photograph. The next afternoon she found herself standing once again inside the small historical exhibit near the waterfront. Rain clouds drifted above Manhattan, casting silver shadows across the river outside the building's glass walls. Visitors wandered quietly between displays, but Charlotte barely noticed them. Her attention remained fixed on the enlarged photograph hanging near the center of the gallery. She stepped closer this time, much closer. The image captured dozens of people gathered outside the children's hospital. Volunteers, donors, teachers, parents. At first glance it looked ordinary, yet now Charlotte noticed details she had missed before. Luca stood farther from the cameras than anyone else. Almost hidden, almost invisible, and still his attention was directed toward her. Not for a second, not by accident, the realization unsettled her. The photograph had been taken nearly 3 weeks before the blackout, 3 weeks before a stranger knocked on her apartment door, 3 weeks before she ever learned his name. Charlotte lowered her gaze and felt a chill move through her chest. If Luca already knew who she was before that night, then everything she thought she understood about their meeting suddenly became more complicated. Her phone vibrated. A message appeared on the screen. Luca, can we talk? Charlotte stared at the words for several seconds. Then she typed a simple reply, yes. An hour later they met in a quiet garden courtyard behind a museum overlooking the river. Autumn leaves drifted across stone pathways. The air smelled faintly of rain and damp earth. Unlike their previous conversations, neither seemed interested in small talk. Charlotte held the photograph in her hands. Luca noticed immediately. You found it. You knew I would. He nodded. Eventually, Charlotte looked directly at him. You were watching me before the blackout. It was not a question. Luca remained silent for a moment. Then he sat beside a stone fountain and gestured for her to join him. Charlotte sat cautiously. The fountain water moved quietly between them. 3 weeks before the blackout, Luca began, I attended a fundraising event at the hospital. Charlotte waited. You were there with a literacy program. Her pulse quickened. You remember that? A faint smile appeared. You spent 20 minutes helping a little girl find a book she had misplaced. Charlotte frowned. That is what you remember? Yes. Why? Luca looked toward the fountain. Because everyone else at that event was trying to impress someone. His voice remained calm. Politicians wanted attention. Executives wanted publicity. Donors wanted recognition. He paused. You were the only person who seemed interested in helping a child. Charlotte did not know what to say. The answer felt too simple, too honest. Luca continued. I noticed you, that was all. She studied his face carefully. And then life moved on. His expression darkened slightly. Until the blackout, for a moment neither spoke. The city hummed beyond the museum walls. Ferries crossed the river. Leaves rustled overhead. Then Charlotte asked the question that had been bothering her since the cafe. What really exhaled slowly. Someone I trusted made a decision that put me in danger. Charlotte felt the atmosphere shift instantly. Someone close to you? Luca nodded. Very close. The answer carried more weight than any explanation could. Do you know who? She asked. Luca's jaw tightened. Not yet. Silence settled between them. Charlotte suddenly understood something important. The danger surrounding Luca had never fully disappeared. Whatever happened during the blackout still existed, still waited somewhere beyond the edges of their conversations. And that is why you said I saved your life. Luca looked at her. Yes, his voice softened, because while everyone else was searching for answers, you gave me a place where nobody thought to look. Charlotte lowered her eyes. The fountain reflected fragments of afternoon sunlight across the stone. I did not know any of that, I know. Another quiet moment passed. Then Luca reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. Charlotte unfolded it carefully, her breath caught. It was a copy of the hospital photograph, but this version contained something she had never seen before. A small figure stood near the edge of the frame behind Luca, a man partially hidden among the crowd. His face blurred by distance, his face stood out immediately. The man was looking directly at Luca, not the event, not the cameras. Luca, who is he? Charlotte asked quietly. Luca's expression became unreadable. That, he said, is exactly what I am trying to find out. Charlotte stared at the photograph long after the conversation ended. The blurred figure near the edge of the frame seemed insignificant at first glance, just another person standing in a crowded public event. Yet the way Luca had reacted told her otherwise. She folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into her bag. Neither of them spoke much as they left the museum courtyard. The silence felt different now, less uncertain, more complicated. For the first time, Charlotte understood that the questions surrounding Luca were no longer abstract mysteries appearing in newspaper headlines. They were real, personal, and somehow connected to a night she could never stop thinking about. The following week arrived wrapped in cold autumn air. Wind swept through Manhattan avenues, carrying golden leaves between glass towers. Charlotte returned to her routine at the library, but concentration became increasingly difficult. Every quiet moment brought her thoughts back to the photograph, to the unknown figure, to Luca's admission that someone close to him had betrayed his trust. She tried convincing herself it was none of her business. The argument lasted exactly 3 days. On Friday afternoon, a package arrived at the library addressed to her. No return address, no explanation. Inside, she found a hardcover first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird, one of her favorite novels. A small card rested inside the cover. Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists. No signature appeared beneath the message. None was necessary. Charlotte smiled despite herself. Across the city, Luca continued appearing in newspapers and business journals, groundbreaking ceremonies, charity projects, corporate acquisitions. The public version of him seemed larger than life. Yet every time Charlotte saw his photograph, she remembered the man sitting quietly beside a fountain discussing trust. Those two versions no longer felt separate. They were becoming impossible to untangle. Late Sunday afternoon, Charlotte received another message. This time it contained only an address, no greeting, no explanation. Beneath it appeared a single sentence. I think you should see this. Curiosity won immediately. 2 hours later, she arrived at an office building overlooking the East River. A security guard escorted her through private elevators to the highest floor. When the doors opened, Charlotte stepped into a space unlike anything she had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows surrounded the entire office. The skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Sunlight reflected across the water in ribbons of gold. Luca stood near the windows with his hands in his pockets. He turned as she entered. Thank you for coming. Charlotte looked around. Most people invite someone to coffee. I am trying to improve my social skills. The answer earned a small laugh. Then his expression grew serious. He handed her a tablet displaying several photographs. Charlotte immediately recognized the blurred figure from the hospital image. This time there were more pictures, different locations, different dates, different events, yet the same man appeared repeatedly in the background, sometimes near Luca, sometimes farther away, always watching. How many photographs are there? Charlotte asked. More than 20. Her eyes widened, and nobody noticed. Nobody connected them. Luca stepped closer to the window. Until recently, Charlotte continued examining the images. A strange pattern slowly emerged. Every photograph had been taken before the blackout. Before the night, everything changed. He was tracking your movements, she said quietly. Luca nodded. That is our conclusion. Charlotte lowered the tablet. Do you know who he works with? No. The answer came too quickly. Not dishonest, frustrated. We know he had access to information he should never have possessed. Luca looked toward the city below, which means someone inside my organization helped him. The realization settled heavily between them. Charlotte finally understood why trust mattered so much to him. Betrayal from a stranger was painful. Betrayal from someone close was something else entirely. The office grew quiet. Evening sunlight deepened across the skyline. Helicopters moved through the distance. Ferries crossed the river below. Then Charlotte noticed something unusual. One of the photographs displayed a familiar location, her library. She frowned and enlarged the image. The blurred man stood across the street, watching the building, watching her. A cold sensation moved through her chest. Luca. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. He crossed the room immediately. Charlotte pointed toward the image. This was taken before the blackout. Luca's expression hardened. Yes, then why was he watching me? The room fell silent. For the first time since she had known him, Luca looked genuinely unsettled, because that question had only one possible answer. And neither of them liked what it suggested. Somehow, long before Charlotte opened her apartment door, someone else already knew she mattered. Charlotte stared at the photograph while the last traces of sunlight faded beyond the office windows. The image suddenly felt heavier in her hands. Before the blackout, before the storm, before she had ever met Luca, someone had been watching her. The realization settled into her chest like cold stone. How many times was he near the library? She asked quietly. Luca glanced toward the tablet. 3 confirmed occasions, possibly more. Charlotte looked up. Why would anyone care about me? It was the question neither of them could answer. She was a librarian from Brooklyn. She lived in a modest apartment. She spent her days helping children discover books and retirees navigate computer screens. There was nothing remarkable about her life, yet the photograph suggested otherwise. Luca remained silent for several moments. Then he crossed the room and studied the image himself. Maybe he was not interested in you, he said. Maybe he was interested in me. Charlotte frowned. Before we met, perhaps someone expected our paths to cross. The explanation sounded impossible. Unfortunately, it was still the most logical one either of them had. Evening settled over Manhattan. Thousands of lights appeared across the skyline. The East River reflected gold and silver beneath the darkening sky. Charlotte should have left. Instead, she found herself sitting with Luca in a private conference room reviewing photographs, timelines, and dates. Piece by piece, a pattern slowly emerged. Every appearance of the unknown man occurred during public events connected to Luca, charity projects, visits, community programs. The library outreach event simply happened to be one of them. Charlotte leaned back in her chair. So he was tracking your schedule. Yes, and somehow I ended up inside that pattern. Luca nodded. Neither liked the conclusion. A soft knock interrupted the conversation. The door opened and an older man entered carrying several folders. Charlotte recognized him immediately from previous encounters inside the building. He was one of Luca's closest advisors. The man's expression remained professional, but something about his posture felt different. Tense. We found him, he said. The room instantly fell silent. Luca stood. Are you certain? The advisor handed over a photograph. 98% certainty. Charlotte watched Luca study the image. Whatever he saw caused the color to drain slightly from his face. Not fear, disappointment, deep disappointment. Who is it? Charlotte asked. Luca did not answer immediately. He lowered the photograph onto the table, slowly, carefully, as though the paper itself carried weight. Charlotte looked down. The face staring back at her belonged to a man in his early 50s, well-dressed, respectable, familiar. She had seen him before in newspaper articles standing beside Luca at charity events. I know him, she said softly. The advisor nodded grimly. Most people do. Luca turned toward the window overlooking the city. His hands disappeared into his pockets. The silence stretched longer than anyone seemed comfortable with. Finally, Charlotte spoke again. Who is he? Luca stared out at the lights. His name is Victor Hale. The name meant little to Charlotte. And? Another silence followed. Then the advisor answered instead. He has worked beside Mr. Moretti for nearly 12 years. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. 12 years. That was not an employee, that was family and everything except blood. Suddenly the betrayal Luca mentioned weeks earlier felt real, painfully real. You trusted him, she said quietly. Luca's reflection appeared in the glass before him. I trusted him with almost everything. The admission carried no anger, only sadness. The room grew quiet once more. Charlotte found herself looking at the photograph again. Victor Hale smiled confidently beside donors and community leaders. Nothing about him appeared suspicious. Nothing about him suggested secrets, yet appearances had deceived her before. Eventually Luca turned back toward them. His expression had regained its usual calm. We proceed carefully. The advisor nodded. Understood. No accusations. Agreed. No public confrontation, of course. Charlotte listened closely. What surprised her most was Luca's restraint. He seemed less interested in revenge than answers. Less interested in punishment than understanding why. As the meeting ended, the advisor quietly left the room. Charlotte gathered her coat. What happens now? She asked. Luca looked toward the photograph one final time. Now we learn the truth. Charlotte nodded slowly. She expected relief after finally identifying the mysterious figure from the photographs. Instead, a strange unease settled over her, because finding Victor Hale had answered one question while creating another far more troubling one. If the man who betrayed Luca had been standing beside him for 12 years, then how many other secrets were still hiding in plain sight? The truth arrived on a cold evening in late November. Charlotte stood beside the window of her apartment, watching snowflakes drift through the glow of streetlights when her phone rang. Luca's name appeared on the screen. The moment she answered, she knew something had changed. His voice carried a quiet certainty she had never heard before. We found the answer. Less than an hour later, she arrived at a waterfront conference center reserved for a private charity event. The building overlooked the river where black water reflected thousands of city lights. Elegant guests filled the ballroom beyond the entrance. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. Soft music drifted through the room. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Yet beneath the polished atmosphere, tension lingered. Charlotte felt it immediately. Luca met her near the entrance. He wore a dark suit and the calm expression she had come to recognize whenever something important was about to happen. "Victor is here," he said quietly. Charlotte followed his gaze across the room. Victor Hale stood among donors and executives, smiling comfortably as he greeted familiar faces. Nothing about him suggested guilt. Nothing about him suggested betrayal. He looked exactly like a trusted advisor should look. "What happened?" Charlotte asked. Luca handed her a small folder. Inside were documents, financial records, and messages recovered during a weeks-long investigation. Charlotte skimmed the pages carefully. The pattern became obvious almost immediately. Private schedules had been shared. Confidential information had been leaked. Important meetings had been quietly reported to outside parties. Piece by piece, Victor had been feeding information to people who wanted access to Luca's world. Not because he hated Luca, not because he wanted power, because he believed he deserved recognition that never came. The realization felt strangely sad. "All of this because he felt overlooked?" Charlotte asked. Luca nodded. "Sometimes disappointment becomes something dangerous when people carry it for too long." Across the ballroom, Victor laughed at something a guest said. He appeared completely unaware that the truth had finally caught up with him. Charlotte looked at Luca. "What are you going to do?" Luca remained silent for several seconds. Then he answered with the same restraint he had shown from the beginning. "End it. That is all. That is enough," Charlotte understood. No dramatic confrontation, no public humiliation, no revenge. Just an ending, a chance for everyone to walk away from a chapter that had already caused enough damage. A few minutes later, Victor was quietly invited into a private meeting overlooking the river. Charlotte did not attend. She waited alone beside a window while snow continued falling beyond the glass. The city stretched endlessly into the night. Ferries moved through the darkness below. Somewhere inside the building, a 12-year partnership was coming to an end. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Luca returned. His face looked older somehow, not defeated, simply tired. "It is done," he said. Charlotte nodded. She did not ask for details, she did not need them. Some endings deserved privacy. They stood together watching the river in silence. Eventually Luca spoke. "The strange thing is that none of this would have happened if not for that blackout." Charlotte smiled softly. "You mean because someone left a watch in my apartment?" A quiet laugh escaped him. "That too." Then his expression became serious. "Charlotte," she turned toward him. The ballroom noise seemed distant now. The city lights reflected in the windows around them. "For a long time," Luca said, "I thought strength meant never depending on anyone." He paused. "Then a stranger opened a door during the worst night of my year." Charlotte felt her chest tighten. "You keep saying I saved you because you did." His voice remained calm, honest. Not only that night, the words settled between them. No grand declaration followed, no dramatic promises, just truth. The kind that arrived quietly and stayed. Outside, snow continued falling over Manhattan. Inside, something shifted. The mystery that had begun with a blackout was finally over. The betrayal had been uncovered. The questions had been answered. For the first time in months, neither of them needed to search for anything. Yet as Charlotte looked into Luca's eyes, she realized the most important part of the story had never been the mystery at all. It had been what remained after the answers were finally found. 1 year later, the apartment looked completely different. The old hardwood floors still creaked near the kitchen. The bookshelf remained crowded with novels and children's stories, yet everything else felt transformed. Warm light filled every corner. Soft music drifted from a speaker near the window. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. Outside, Brooklyn moved through another winter evening. Inside, peace had finally found a place to stay. Charlotte stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup while snow drifted beyond the glass. The city glowed beneath thousands of lights. Cars moved slowly through quiet streets. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry horn echoed across the river. It reminded her of another night, another winter, another storm. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Not unexpected, familiar. She smiled before reaching the door. Luca stepped inside carrying a paper bag from a neighborhood bakery. Snowflakes rested on his dark coat. "You bought enough bread for an entire block," Charlotte said. "I was told librarians appreciate preparation." "That is not how libraries work. I am still learning." The exchange earned the same smile it always did. Simple, comfortable, real. Luca placed the bag on the counter and removed his coat. The months following Victor Hale's departure had not been easy. Trust rarely repaired itself overnight, yet something remarkable behind walls. Luca had begun rebuilding connections honestly, carefully, patiently. He spent less time hiding behind schedules and meetings, more time supporting the projects he genuinely cared about. Schools, libraries, community programs, places where success could be measured in lives improved rather than headlines earned. Charlotte had watched the transformation happen slowly, one decision at a time. One conversation at a time. The city still viewed Luca Moretti as a powerful man, a wealthy man, an influential man. Charlotte simply saw the stranger who once sat at her kitchen table drinking tea during a blackout. Some truths mattered more than public reputations. Dinner passed quietly. They talked about ordinary things. A reading program expanding into new neighborhoods. A family who donated books to the library. A bakery owner determined to perfect cinnamon rolls. The conversation carried none of the tension that once defined their relationship. The mysteries were gone. The questions were answered. Nothing remained except the life they had chosen to build. Later that evening, Charlotte settled onto the couch with a blanket across her lap. Luca stood near the lamp beside the bookshelf, replacing a light bulb that had finally burned out. "You know," Charlotte said, watching him work, "most people hire someone for that. Most people do not trust me with ladders either." She laughed softly. The sound filled the apartment. Luca looked over his shoulder and smiled. Then the new bulb flickered to life. Warm golden light spread across the room instantly. Both of them paused. The memory arrived at the same time. Candles, darkness, rain against the windows, a frightened city without electricity, one small act of kindness, one open door, an entire future hidden inside a single decision. Luca climbed down carefully and crossed the room. He sat beside Charlotte on the couch. Snow continued falling outside. The city shimmered beyond the glass. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Charlotte looked toward the window. "That night." Luca nodded slowly. "Me too." Silence settled comfortably between them. Not empty silence. The kind built from trust. The kind that no longer needed explanations. Outside, Brooklyn glowed beneath winter lights. Inside, the apartment felt brighter than ever. The city remembered Luca Moretti as a man of influence, a man who shaped skylines, businesses and institutions. Newspapers would remember achievements, rivals would remember victories, history would remember power. But Charlotte remembered something else entirely. She remembered a tired stranger standing outside her door during a blackout, and Luca remembered the woman who opened that door when she had every reason not to. Sometimes the most important moments in life arrived without warning. Not with grand speeches, not with perfect timing, just a simple choice made in the dark, a choice that changed everything. And as snow drifted quietly across the city beyond the window, the lights inside the apartment remained warm, steady and bright.